In 1911, a 14-year-old boy left his father's farm, bound for Chicago. At a time when the only means of transportation were trains or horse carriages, and refrigeration was still considered a luxury found only in the kitchens of the wealthy, this boy would later open a food company that would change the way an entire nation ate breakfast. 31 years after his arrival in Chicago, nearly every grocery store in America carried his name. And that boy, Gideon Hartwell, would become one of the wealthiest men in American history. This is that story. Gideon Hartwell was born on his father's farm on the 14th of March, 1897, in what is now known as Marrow Creek, Illinois. His father, Elias Hartwell, owned a small dairy and grain farm where everyone in the family lived and worked. Being the oldest son of 5 children, Gideon was expected to take over the family business. However, he was nothing like his father, and was never interested in the slow rhythms of farm life. At the time, dairy farming was unpredictable, backbreaking, and entirely dependent on the weather. While Gideon did his best to help out around the property, he hated the sheer monotony of it. Like most kids his age, Gideon didn't particularly enjoy school, and never made it past the 7th grade. He preferred to tinker with things using his own hands, and from a young age, he became fascinated with the idea of preserving food. This fascination began in his mother's kitchen, where he watched her can vegetables and cure meats to survive the harsh Illinois winters. At the age of 9, his mother let him help seal jars of preserved tomatoes, and Gideon became obsessed with the process. He began experimenting on his own, filling old jars with anything he could find, salting, curing, and pickling scraps from the kitchen, just to see how long they would last. He later gained a small reputation around Marrow Creek as the boy who could keep food edible long after everyone else's had spoiled. When Gideon turned 11, he came across an ice house for the first time during a trip into town with his father. That's when his curiosity about preservation turned into something closer to obsession. The ice house workers cut massive blocks from the frozen river each winter and packed them in sawdust to last through the summer. Gideon could not understand how something as ordinary as sawdust could hold back the heat of July. For the next few years, he spent every spare hour pestering those workers with questions about how the blocks were cut, stored, and shipped. And he began keeping a small notebook where he wrote down anything he learned about cold. By the time he was 13, he had built a small insulated box of his own, using sawdust and scrap wood to keep food cold through the summer months. His father thought it was a foolish way to spend an afternoon, but Gideon would check on his little box every day the way other boys his age checked on traps or fishing lines. He was constantly adjusting the thickness of the walls and the type of material packed inside, trying to see how long he could keep a block of ice from melting. But his life took a turn when Gideon lost his mother, Eleanor Hartwell, during the winter influenza outbreak that swept through the county. Gideon had shared a deep bond with his mother more than anyone else on the farm. She was the one who had shown him the kitchen, the jars, the very beginning of everything he loved. Devastated by her loss, Gideon's restlessness on the farm intensified. He began looking for a way out, as the farm now held too many memories of the woman who started it all. After turning 14, and against the wishes of his father, Gideon packed a small bag and left Marrow Creek in search of a new direction in life. At the time, Chicago was rapidly becoming the food processing capital of the country, thanks to the rail lines, the stockyards, and the cold storage warehouses springing up along the river. The city was hungry for young hands willing to work. It was here in Chicago where Gideon would plunge headfirst into reinventing himself, learning everything there was to know about food storage and preservation. He took a job as a stock boy at a meatpacking warehouse known as Dunmore and Sons. Unfortunately, Gideon was let go after only 11 days for rearranging the cold storage shelves without permission. After being unemployed for some weeks, he found work as an apprentice at a small canning operation called Brindlewood Preserves, where he earned $1.90 per week. But it wasn't enough to cover his rent. So Gideon found a second job sweeping floors at a butcher shop, after hours for an extra $1 a week. Despite working both jobs to make ends meet, Gideon would still spend his evenings reading anything he could find about food spoilage, bacteria, and the new science of refrigeration. In 1915, when he turned 18, Gideon decided to return home to Illinois briefly to see his ailing father. He still had no interest in farming, so he spent most of his visit in his father's barn, experimenting with a small icebox he had shipped back from Chicago piece by piece. A neighboring farmer noticed Gideon's tinkering and asked him to help figure out why his milk kept turning before it reached the train station. Gideon solved the problem by insulating the delivery cart with a double layer of sawdust, and word of the fix spread quickly through the county. From there, Gideon's reputation as someone who understood cold and preservation began to spread beyond Marrow Creek. Word of Gideon's talent eventually reached a regional representative of the Colby Ice and Cold Storage Company of Springfield, and the company hired him. Gideon's job was to travel throughout central Illinois, inspecting and servicing cold storage rooms for small grocers and creameries. In the year 1917, Gideon met Margaret Ann Dolan at a church social in Springfield, and the two grew close over the following year. As a parting gift before Margaret's family relocated, Gideon's father sent him $20 he had been quietly saving. Rather than spending it on anything for himself, Gideon had other ideas. In 1919, Gideon and Margaret married and moved to a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago. Around this time, Gideon came across a trade pamphlet describing a new method coming out of the Northeast for flash freezing vegetables rather than slow freezing them. This method was being used in small experimental batches by a handful of northeastern packers and was very different and far more effective than traditional freezing. For one thing, the food retained its texture and flavor because the ice crystals that formed inside it were too small to rupture the cell walls. Although this new method was beginning to draw attention on the East Coast, only a handful of people in the Midwest had even heard of it. Luckily for him, Gideon tracked down a small operator in Indiana who had built a crude flash freezing unit. Gideon immediately became fixated on the idea, but he couldn't fully understand the engineering behind it. The fact that it required carefully controlled temperatures and specialized brine solutions made things even more complicated. Knowing he needed to learn more, Gideon applied for a position as a night technician at the Union Cold Storage and Ice Company for a salary of $38 a month. At the time, the company was one of the largest cold storage operators in Chicago, supplying ice and refrigerated space to hundreds of grocers and restaurants across the city. His job was to monitor the cooling systems through the night and respond if anything broke down. But when everything ran smoothly, he had plenty of idle hours. This gave Gideon more than enough time to study the chemistry of freezing and immerse himself in the emerging science of food preservation. In 1920, Gideon and Margaret welcomed their first and only child to survive infancy, a son they named Walter Dolan Hartwell. Just 4 months after his birth, Gideon was promoted to Assistant Superintendent of Refrigeration at a salary of $72 a month. That same year, Gideon succeeded in building his first working flash freezing chamber in a rented shed behind the Union Cold Storage facility. The first real step toward his dream of bringing frozen food into ordinary American kitchens. It wasn't until the 11th of September, 1923, at exactly 2 in the morning, when he finally completed his first reliable batch of flash-frozen sweet corn. He called the process the QuickChill Method. The QuickChill rig was essentially a crude assembly of borrowed brine tanks and a hand-cranked conveyor, powered by a small electric motor he had rebuilt himself. While the experiment was successful, it had a few issues. This early version had no consistent way to package the corn afterward, and so much of it spoiled within days once it left the cold chamber. The biggest problem was that the corn often froze unevenly, leaving soft spots that rotted faster than the rest. Gideon made multiple adjustments to the process, but the most notable was developing a wax-coated paper sleeve to seal the corn immediately after freezing. He later sold his small batch of frozen corn to 2 grocers in the neighborhood for $6 total, and used the money toward another, bigger project. With the support of a local grocer named Arthur Kesseling, Gideon began to build his first real commercial operation, and completed the build-out by the spring of 1925. This new operation was larger, sturdier, and far more consistent than his backyard experiment. One afternoon, Gideon brought a wealthy grain merchant by the name of Cornelius Whitfield to see a demonstration of the QuickChill process. By the end of the demonstration, Cornelius wanted to be part of Gideon's venture. Soon after, they shook hands, and on the 2nd of June, 1925, the Hartwell Frozen Foods Company was born. Unfortunately, the company failed only 14 months later, and for several reasons. Gideon's ideas about which vegetables to focus on were not in line with the stakeholders' ideas, who were pressuring him to expand into frozen meats far too early. Gideon argued that meat behaved nothing like a vegetable once frozen, and that rushing into it before the process was properly understood would damage the company's reputation before it had even built one. But the investors wanted faster growth and a wider product line, and they were not interested in waiting for Gideon to be satisfied. Another reason was that most of the wax paper and tin packaging Gideon needed was supplied by a single struggling vendor in Ohio. Whenever a shipment was delayed, the entire freezing schedule had to be pushed back. This slowed production by a significant amount of time. His first product line, which he called the Farmstead Pack, took 8 months to perfect, and only a few hundred cases were shipped during the company's entire existence. As a result of all this, Gideon was pushed out of his own company by his investors, who decided a man so consumed by getting every detail right was not the man to run a business that needed to grow quickly. Even though his first company had failed, Gideon remained optimistic. He was almost relieved when he was forced out, because there was less pressure on him, and now he could focus on the parts of the process that actually fascinated him. Gideon decided to turn his attention toward something smaller and more controllable: home and restaurant scale freezing units. Grocers and small restaurant owners across the Midwest were desperate for a way to keep produce and fish fresh longer without paying for industrial cold storage. And besides, despite knowing a number of well-connected people in Chicago, not many of them were willing to invest in him again after what happened with Hartwell Frozen Foods. A year later, Gideon's redesigned countertop freezing unit was demonstrated at a regional grocer's exposition outside Chicago, and outperformed a far bulkier and more expensive unit built by an established refrigeration manufacturer from Minneapolis. The Minneapolis unit took up nearly a full corner of a back room and still struggled to hold a steady temperature. Gideon's compact design fit on a single countertop and held its brine temperature within a single degree for hours at a stretch. His compact unit, which used his QuickChill brine method on a smaller scale, became the talk of the exposition floor. Grocers lined up 3 deep just to watch him run a demonstration batch of green beans, and that kind of attention gave investors the confidence they needed to back Gideon a second time. The result was the birth of the North Star Frozen Provisions Company, with Gideon as head of operations. The company set up shop in a converted warehouse near the Chicago River, and within its first year, had placed countertop units in nearly 60 independent grocers across Illinois and Indiana. Not too long after, Gideon's position was again hanging on a thin thread. He kept pouring resources into refining the equipment itself, constantly redesigning the brine tanks and motor housings rather than focusing on selling more product. This frustrated his investors, who wanted him to slow down on tinkering and ramp up distribution. They brought in an outside operations man named Victor Pemberton to do their bidding. Gideon was insulted they had brought in someone else to manage what he had built, and so he left the company. In an interview many years later, Gideon was quoted as saying, "I walked away determined never again to let other men decide what my work was for." Victor Pemberton followed the wishes of the investors and went on to grow the company into a modest regional distributor that still exists today as a minor Midwestern brand. With Gideon Hartwell gone, the name of the company eventually changed from North Star Frozen Provisions to Pemberton Cold Storage. Gideon and a young engineer he had met at the Grocers Exposition named Samuel Ostroff continued tinkering with smaller freezing units. Together they found a quiet but steady niche building custom cold storage equipment for fish markets along the Great Lakes. By 1929, Gideon's designs had become known for being far more reliable than anything else on the market. And fish markets from Milwaukee to Detroit were requesting his equipment by name. With that kind of reputation, Gideon knew he could be backed again by investors whenever he was ready to start up his third company. With the support and financial backing of 9 investors, especially a produce wholesaler from Chicago named Irwin T. Lassiter, Gideon's third company came to life. The company was initially called Hartwell and Ostroff Equipment, but was later changed to the Hartwell Frozen Foods Corporation in 1930. After failing in his first 2 attempts, Gideon was determined not to fail again. This time, he turned his attention to creating a frozen vegetable product that was affordable for the ordinary American household. At the time, frozen food was still considered something for restaurants, wealthy households, or grocers with specialized cold cases. The equipment required was expensive, and the supply chain to keep food frozen from factory to store to home simply did not exist yet. At the start of his new company, Gideon made a statement to his associates and investors, "I will put a vegetable in every American icebox, grown at its peak, frozen within hours, and sold at a price that will not embarrass a working family's grocery bill." Gideon had a knack for identifying overlooked but hard-working talent. He hired several young chemists and engineers who shared and believed in his vision. As for the packaging of the product, Gideon went through more than 15 versions before he settled on one that finally worked. He called it the Farm Fresh Box. For the next 4 years, Gideon kept improving the Farm Fresh Box, which was followed by an expanded line called the Farm Fresh Select. But in those 4 years, what really changed wasn't the improvement of the box itself. It was how the vegetables inside it were being grown, harvested, and moved. One of the things Gideon learned from his failed businesses was the importance of controlling the supply chain from the field all the way to the freezer. So he leased farmland directly outside Chicago to grow peas and corn specifically for his freezing process, rather than buying whatever the market happened to offer that week. He insisted that the vegetables be picked at a very specific stage of ripeness and rushed to the plant within hours, arguing that a single day's delay in the field could ruin everything he had spent years perfecting inside the freezing chamber. One day, during a visit to a meatpacking plant on the south side, Gideon stood on a catwalk above the floor and watched as a single steer was moved from one station to the next, each worker performing one small task before the carcass moved on to the next pair of hands. That's when a bright idea came to him. If he could reverse the same idea for vegetables, moving them rapidly from field truck to wash station to blanching tank to freezing chamber without ever stopping. He could freeze far larger volumes without losing quality. He stayed on that catwalk long after his business there was finished, simply watching and sketching the layout in his notebook. At the time, most small operators froze vegetables in small, disconnected batches, carting trays from one room to another by hand. The process was slow and inconsistent, with no two batches ever turning out quite the same. So in 1931, Gideon raised more money and built his own processing plant. He employed over 200 workers and began experimenting with a continuous freezing line inside his new facility. It wasn't until 1933 when the production of the Farm Fresh Select line would really first make full use of the continuous freezing line. But even then, the system was still a work in progress. It did, however, increase the level of production by nearly 6 times, and his new product line became the best-selling frozen vegetable brand in the Midwest. But Gideon had set his sights on even greater things. Gideon built his own packaging plant in 1934 to start producing his own wax-sealed cartons and printing his own labels, rather than depending on outside suppliers who had nearly sunk his first company. Around this time, Gideon also perfected a faster blanching technique using precisely timed steam exposure. It was this discovery that really paved the way to a new era for the frozen food industry. The steam blanching technique preserved color and nutrients far better than the boiling methods used by competitors and locked in a flavor that tasted noticeably closer to fresh produce. Gideon used this new technique for his new flagship product, one that would later become one of the most successful grocery items in American history: the Farm Fresh Garden Peas. Gideon Hartwell dreamed of putting good food within reach of the ordinary American family, and the Farm Fresh Garden Peas were the answer to that dream. When they were first released onto store shelves, they were priced higher than canned peas, but lower than anything else frozen on the market. The price for a box of Farm Fresh Garden Peas was set at 19 cents, something around $4 in today's currency. Despite costing more than canned vegetables, it quickly became a fixture on grocery shelves across the Midwest. In the weeks following its wider release, nearly 40,000 cases were ordered by grocers in just the Chicago area alone. The Hartwell Frozen Foods Corporation soon became the leading frozen vegetable producer in the Midwest. Gideon realized he needed a bigger facility to keep up with grocer demand across several states, and so in 1936 he built a new plant in Waukegan, Illinois, right along the rail lines. After several rounds of refinement, the continuous freezing and packaging line was officially running at full capacity by 1938. This allowed raw vegetables to move from delivery truck straight through washing, blanching, freezing, and boxing without ever sitting idle. The new process reduced the time from harvest to frozen package from nearly 2 full days down to under 6 hours. By 1940, their production rate of over 400,000 cases a month was more than every other frozen vegetable producer in the Midwest combined. Between 1936 and 1942, the number of farm fresh boxes being produced moved from roughly 100,000 cases a year to well over 11 million. By then, nearly 1 in 3 frozen vegetable packages sold anywhere east of the Mississippi carried the Hartwell name. And Gideon had another move that would set him apart in the grocery market. Every year, as the production output of farm fresh vegetables increased, he lowered the price of the boxes. By 1942, a box of Farm Fresh Garden Peas that had once sold for 19 cents was now selling for 11. But that wasn't the only strategy Gideon adopted. Despite pioneering large-scale frozen food production with his continuous line, a number of his workers were not happy with the change. Many of the original canning and packing hands who had joined him in the early days found the repetitive stations along the new line tedious. The more experienced workers among them felt the new system had reduced their role to a single narrow task, instead of overseeing a full batch from start to finish. As a result, some experienced workers began leaving Hartwell Frozen Foods to work at smaller operators who still ran things the old way. To combat this, Gideon raised the base wage for plant workers significantly, placing it well above what most food processors in the region were paying. He made the decision after watching 3 of his most experienced freezer operators hand in their notice within the same week, men he had personally trained and could not afford to keep replacing. Many in the industry doubted this move, believing it would eat into the company's margins. But it did the opposite. Skilled workers from canneries and packing plants across Illinois and Wisconsin began applying for jobs at Waukegan in search of the higher pay. Gideon found he could now be selective, hiring only the steadiest and most careful hands for a job where one careless minute could spoil an entire batch. Not only did Gideon raise the pay of his workers, but he also shortened the standard shift by an hour while keeping pay the same. The change in shift length allowed Gideon to add an additional shift and run the Waukegan plant nearly around the clock during peak harvest season. Soon enough, several other regional frozen food producers had to raise their own wages in fear of losing workers to Hartwell. Gideon had changed the way the frozen food business treated its labor force across much of the Midwest. In 1944, Gideon grew tired of the ongoing friction with several of his remaining outside investors and decided to buy them out entirely. The result was several newly wealthy men scattered across Illinois and Indiana, but it also made Gideon Hartwell the sole owner of the largest frozen vegetable company in the Midwest. Later, Gideon made his son Walter, who was then 24 years old, the president of the company. But it was Gideon who still quietly ran the show from behind the scenes. However, total control of the company came with a price that even the wealthiest man in Illinois could not avoid forever. Gideon continued to believe firmly that plain frozen vegetables, sold simply and cheaply, were what most American households truly wanted. To him, the box of peas had always been the point, the whole reason he had spent his life chasing the cold in the first place. He was not eager to dilute that idea with trays of meat and gravy and mashed potatoes. He largely dismissed the growing interest among shoppers in more convenient prepared frozen meals being introduced by smaller rivals on the East Coast, calling them a passing novelty that housewives would tire of within a season. Being stubborn and set in his ways, he refused to seriously listen to other Hartwell executives or even his own son Walter when they suggested it was time to develop a frozen dinner line of their own. Walter brought him sample trays on more than one occasion, and each time Gideon waved them away, saying a family did not need a company telling it what to put on the plate alongside its peas. By the late 1940s, Gideon could no longer ignore the slipping sales figures as competitors began capturing the growing market for ready-made frozen meals. So he finally agreed to shut down part of the original Farm Fresh production line and begin developing the company's first frozen dinner product. However, this new product, called the Farm Fresh Family Supper, was no longer developed primarily at the Waukegan plant, but at a newly built and far more modern facility along the Fox River in northern Illinois. In his new facility, Gideon wanted to include every step of the process, from the test kitchens developing the recipes to the final packaging of the trays, which he largely accomplished. It became one of the larger frozen food complexes in the region. However, Gideon's habit of personally signing off on every major decision was no longer well suited to a company competing in a market that was changing every few months. By 1953, Hartwell Frozen Foods had slipped to 4th place in the national frozen food market, behind 3 faster-moving competitors. Even with Gideon's later improvements to the steam blanching process, it was not enough. things only grew more difficult, and with rising competition and tightening margins across the industry, Hartwell Frozen Foods was forced to scale back several product lines and reduce staff at its older facilities. In 1958, Gideon's son Walter died unexpectedly of a heart ailment, and so Gideon kept running the company for 3 more years before finally turning over control of Hartwell Frozen Foods to his grandson, Gideon Walter Hartwell II. Gideon retired to his property outside Waukegan and later died of complications from pneumonia on the 11th of January, 1962. Life is little more than a string of lessons, each one leaving you slightly larger than you were before, even when it is difficult to see that at the time. For the world was never built to be easy, and we must come to understand that the failures and disappointments we carry along the way are what quietly push us forward. Those were the words of Gideon Hartwell, a boy who left a farm with nothing but curiosity and a notebook full of questions about cold. A man who failed twice, was pushed out of his own companies, and still came back a third time with something to prove. A man who changed the way an entire nation fed itself, not with grand gestures or inherited wealth, but with patience, stubbornness, and an obsession with getting the details right. Today, Hartwell Frozen Foods holds a market value of around $2.4 billion and remains a familiar name in grocery freezer aisles across much of the Midwest. The boy from Marrow Creek never stopped chasing the cold. And because of that, neither did the rest of us. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more forgotten pioneers waiting to be remembered.